welcome back to my channel. My name is Edson. Today I want to talk about basic authentication. Basic authentication is an HTTP framework. It's a general framework for access control and authentication. So to define it better, I prepared some notes here. Basic authentication, which can be termed basic auth, is a simple authentication mechanism built into HTTP protocol. It allows a client, for example, a browser or front-end application, to provide credentials, the username and password, in the HTTP request to authenticate with the server. Reasons why you might want to use this: it's quite simple to implement and then requires no additional libraries or complex setup. Basic authentication is often used in simple applications testing or prototyping, where advanced authentication mechanisms are not necessary. There are limitations: security. Credentials are sent in every request, and if the connection is not encrypted, for example, if you are not using HTTPS, they can be intercepted by attackers. Base64, which is used to encode the credentials, is not encryption. It is easily reversible. And then scalability is not ideal for large-scale applications. No session management, so you must send credentials in each and every request. When to use basic authentication: in small applications, for simple apps, prototyping when building a quick prototype, or proof of concept for internal tools or systems where security is less critical and HTTPS is enforced. If you want to create production-grade application, you should consider using more secure and scalable authentication mechanisms like JWT, which is short for JSON Web Tokens, or auth or session-based authentication. Let's look at how this HTTP authentication works. You have a client, which can be your phone, your iPad, your laptop, and then you have a server somewhere, and you're trying to access a web page. When you visit a certain address, your phone will send a request if you don't send any credentials. In this case, that endpoint that you're trying to send a request requires you to send some credentials or username, password. The server replies with an unauthorized 401, and then also it will send this header right here to notify you that you need to authenticate using the basic auth. This is a way for the server to ask for credentials. And so the way you provide those credentials is you're going to send an authorization header with your username and your password, but it's going to be base64 encoded. And so it will be encoded like this: basic, and then this will be your username and password encoded in base64. The server is going to check for your credentials. If credentials are valid, then it will give you access to that resource. Otherwise, it will send a 401 unauthorized request. And so I'll show you. We're going to build a simple application and see how we can implement this. I'm going to head over to the desktop, and then we start creating our project. So go to your desktop, create a folder on your desktop. I'm going to name this basic_auth like this. By the way, you need to have Node installed on your computer. Open up your command prompt or your terminal, and here you want to check for Node-V, and if you see a version right here, you are good to go. Otherwise, you can just visit the Node official website and then download Node. After you have your Node installation, or you confirm that you have Node, then we can go ahead and open this folder right here. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code, so I'm going to right click this and show more options. Now I have my folder. You can see up here it's open in Visual Studio Code. We need two dependencies using NodeMon to restart our server, which is going to be a dev dependency, and Express, which we're going to use to create our server. I want you to open your terminal. Make sure you are in the folder basic auth, and you want to run this command npm init like this, and then you pass the -y flag and hit enter. You'll see a package.json created. If you open that, the name is basic auth. You want the main to be server.js. That's all you need for now in this file. You can close it, and then we're going to install our first dependency, which is Express. You want to run npm I for installing the Express like this. Hit enter. You should go through the installation. Okay, you can see now we have two more files added. One is package log.json, and then the other one is node modules, where Express has been installed. It comes with its own dependencies as well, and also everything is installed here. You don't need to touch these two files right here. Okay, so we can open again our package.json, and then we can see we have a property here, dependencies, and we have Express right here. The other dependency that we're going to use is NodeMon, but this one is going to be a dev dependency. So the way you do it is npm I-D for dev dependency at NodeMon. like this. Yeah, so you can see in our page.json, now we have another dependency, but this time it's a dev dependency. In the next step, let me create our main file, which is going to be server.js, but you can name it whatever you want. So inside here, I named it server.js. So make sure you are in the main project, server.js. You should have a .js extension. For us to create our server, we use const express. Then we require, in quotation marks, express. We're going to create an app, an instance of express. So we say const express. So we're going to call this express right here, which we required. This is the express that we're using down here. And then we're going to create const port. I'm going to run this on port 8000. And we're going to call our app.listen. We want our server to start listening to requests. So it's going to listen on port, which is this port right here, and can also take in a callback function. So I'm going to log to the console, and of course I'll use backticks, server running on port, and then I'll pass in the port as a string literal like this. That's why I'm using backticks. Okay, so once we have this, we can save this, and then we go back to our page.json. We want to create a script so that we can run our server. We're going to call this dev, and then we call nodemon on our file. So we can say nodemon space and then server.js. Okay, so nodemon will run our server.js. So in our terminal, we can run npm run dev. If I run this, you see right here, it says our server is running on port 8000, which is what we have in our server right here. Okay, so we have successfully created our server, and you can see it's running, but it's actually doing nothing. It's serving nothing because we haven't created any endpoints. So for us to be able to create an endpoint, I'll consult with our documentation, Express documentation. You can see we have app, which is an instance of Express method, HTTP request method. There is get, put, post. There is also delete, and a number of other methods that you can use. But in our case, we're going to use the get method. So the method has to be in lowercase, and then we provide the path, which is a path on the server, and then a handler function executed when the route is meshed. So here to create our route, we call the instance app, and then we say .get in all lowercase like this. And then in here, we can pass in the path and then the handler function. Our path is going to be /API, but you can actually name this anything you want. But it has to be a string like this in quotation marks. Let me close this down here. Our handler function can be a regular function or an R function. So let me just use an R function. I love using R functions. So this takes in the requests and the response. So you have the request object coming from the client. The response is coming from the server. We want to respond. So this response object has got a number of methods. One of those methods is send. So we can send plain text. I'm going to say welcome to our website. So if somebody visits this endpoint, they're supposed to get this message in plain text. So let me save this and visit this endpoint right here. So localhost port 8000 /API and hit that. You can see we are hitting that endpoint. This /API is the path on the server. This is the path on the server. So we are saving this information on this particular path. We're just going to use this single endpoint right here. As things stand now, anyone can visit this and access this information. This is where Basic Auth comes in. You want to restrict access to this resource right here. So you have to authenticate someone, then authorize them depending on their credentials. If they are allowed, then they get access. If they're not, they won't get access. Okay, so the way we do this is by using what we call middleware. What is middleware? In express.js, by the way, these are functions. Are functions that have access to the requests and the response object and the next middleware function in the application's request response cycle. We can see down here how they used it. It takes in request, response, and next, and then it does something, and then it passes on execution to the next function. So in our case, we have to define a function out here. Function authenticate. It takes in the request, the response, and the next. It can either pass execution to this function right here or to an error handler function. That's what this next is all about. It's a callback function, in other words. Okay, so if we are to go to our documentation for the implementation of Basic Auth, if somebody sends in a request with no authorization, then we should respond and say you are unauthorized with a status of 401, and we should alert them to provide some kind of authentication, which is just an authorization header to confirm that they are authorized to access this resource. However, if they do provide that authorization, then we should check their credentials. If the credentials are valid, we give them access to the resource. Otherwise, they have to resubmit their credentials. The way that they're supposed to submit their credentials is via the headers. In the request headers, we need to look for authorization in that request header. We can access the headers via the request, which is this request.headers.authorization. We can store this in a variable. I'm going to call this auth header. If we do have this, we're going to do one thing. If we don't, we're going to do another thing. If not auth header, I'm going to create a variable here called error. I'm going to create a new error right here. I'll pass in a message and say unauthorized. That is if they don't provide those credentials via the authorization header. We need to send back a response header with this information to let them know that they need to provide an authorization header, www-authenticate basic. So we say response. We can set header for the response object. So it takes into arguments. So we need to provide the name of the header and the value of the header. So in this case, the documentation says the name is going to be this www-authenticate. So in quotation marks, 3 W's dash authenticate. The value here is basic. So I'm going to say basic right here. So this is a header that we're going to set on the response object. Then we set the error status, error.status, and we set that to 401. That's the status for unauthorized. And after we do this, we call next, which is this. So we pass on the execution to the next handler function. In this case, we're just passing in error in here. So it automatically terminates the execution and send back the error. It won't pass this execution to this function right here. So the way we use this authenticate now, there are two ways that we could use this. We could pass it here as a second argument. In this app.get, we could call it here authenticate. It should be in the middle because it's a middleware. We could also use it in a different way, which I'm going to use. We call the app.use method, and then we pass in this function right here. We don't call it, we just pass in the name like this. And the way we're going to test our application, I'm going to use an extension, a REST client. So look for REST client, this one right here. So I want you to install this extension in Visual Studio Code. So once you have this installed, I want you to go back to your project. In this project folder, you need to create a file, which I usually call request. It has to have a .rest extension, or it can have a .http extension. So I'm going to stick with HTTP. I will create this. For us to send requests to an endpoint on our server, we have to check for this method right here. In our case, we are sending to this endpoint, which is a GET request. And so we need to write get, specify the request method. So the endpoint is HTTP, not HTTPS, :// localhost, 8000 / API. You can try and hit this endpoint by visiting this link right here. So let's send our request. And indeed, you can see this is what we get back. It says unauthorized 401 and say the error is unauthorized down here. But of course, there is plenty of other information which we can control later if we don't want this kind of response. If you visit this in the browser, let's visit this in the browser and see what happens in the browser. Localhost 8000 / API. You can see how the browser responds. I say sign in to access this site. Authorization required. Here I'm going to say return. I don't have to say else down here. We return this thing right here. Otherwise, we're going to move on next. If we do provide credentials, we're going to pass our execution to this one right here, but we haven't defined how we're going to handle those credentials. We can save this and try and run in this right here. Let me send a request. We are not authorized because we do not provide any authorization header. If you want to provide authorization, you can say authorization. It has to be basic. and then some credentials, the user and the password. Let's try this endpoint again. Now we have an authorization, send request. You can see now we're getting that information. We can say, welcome to our website. We are now getting access simply because we are now getting the auth header. So it gets to this and then we are good. I want to log to the console, the request.headers, and check what we're getting from the headers. So let me remove this authorization for now. Let me save this and hit this endpoint. You can see we are unauthorized. Let me go to the console. You can see we're getting this right here is our request.headers. We don't have any authorization right here. That's why this is not going through. But if I were to provide an authorization header here, I don't mind about this information right here. We're going to do with that in a moment. Send a request. We are getting access to the information and we are getting an authorization header down here. You can see authorization and exactly the information that we passed in that authorization header. The next thing we need to check the credentials, whether the credentials are valid or not. So the way I'm going to approach this, I'm going to create some kind of a database. It's going to be an array. Okay, so I'm going to say const here users, and it's going to be an array of users object with a username. Let's say Saturn, a password, it tests 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the only user who is allowed to access this endpoint. If you don't have these credentials, you are not allowed to access this. So how do we implement this? We need to encode this into base64. That's what the documentation says. So if we go to the documentation, you need to supply your credentials encoded in base64. So it has to be basic and then the credentials here. So the way we're going to encode this, we can just search online, base64 encoding online. So let's go to this website right here. We can encode our credentials. So the way we encode our credentials, username, password. Our username is capital letter Sadson and our password is test1234. So I'll say capital letter Sadson, Remember to put that colon between the username and the password. The password is test1234. Okay, so I'll hit the encode button, which is down here. Okay, once encoded, you'll get this base64 encoded data. It's equivalent to this. So I can copy this. That's what I'm going to pass where it says base64 user password right here. So I'm going to paste that. This represents my username and my password. And that's how we should pass it in the authorization header. Okay, so once we pass this in the authorization header, in our application, we want to decode this information. I can log it to the console now. So let's check out the console and see what we have. Let me open the console, stop the server for now, clear this and run it one more time. Let me send a request. You can see we are getting access and we are getting this authorization as basic, the username and the password. Of course, this is encoded in base64. We need a way to decode this and then compare with this user that we have in our database. I'm going to say const auth. There's a method called buffer which can decode base64 encoded values. So we can say dot from. So it takes in two arguments. It takes in the array buffer that you're trying to decode, and you have to specify that it's base64. That's the second argument. So what we are taking here is this auth header dot split. We want to split this auth header. We want to split it along this space right here so that we get only this value right here. We want to remove this basic along the space, and then we get the element on index 1. What split does is going to turn this into an array with two values. I'm splitting this auth header and I'm getting these two values, and I want to access the second value. But with arrays, always zero index based. Right? And then we also pass in quotation marks. We need to specify that this is base64. Let's log to the console what we're getting in this auth. I'm going to remove the header so that we don't have a lot of information logged to the console. I'm also going to, let me just comment this out. So I'm going to open request and send our request, and we are getting access. But the most important thing is our terminal. So you see we're getting a buffer here, but we need to turn this to a string, dot to string. Let me run this again and see what it looks like if we turn it to a string. Let me save this and visit our endpoint. You can see we're getting sets on test 1, 2, 3, 4. Once we get this, of course, we want to separate this username and the password along this colon right here, which is exactly the way we encoded it. Let's attach it at the end right here. We're going to split it again along the colon. This time we are splitting it along the colon. And let's log to the console the auth again. Let me save this and open my terminal. So let me revisit this endpoint right here, send request. You can see now we're getting an array with citizen and test 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so once we get this information, this array right here, we're going to compare with our username right here. So we can say here, const user is equals to users dot we find. We're using the find method of an array, and here we pass in the user u dot, let me see, it's username right here. User dot username is similar to auth0. This returns an array with 2 values, which is a username and a password. So that username is going to be auth0 right here. So if you find a match right here, it means we have a user. So we can log this to the console. You have to do this step by step, otherwise you won't understand what's going on. You can log that user to the console. I'm going to open my terminal. Let me send a request, send request. We're getting an OK. So we are getting an object here. You can see it has username, citizen, and password test 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're getting a user. Okay, so we have our user right here. We're going to allow them access to this right here, because what is allowing us access to this endpoint is this next right here. So we can say if we do have a user and that user dot password is equal to auth1, that means we are trying to match their passwords. This user that we found, which is in our database, is this password similar to what we are getting from the authorization header? If that is similar, then of course we're going to allow them access to this endpoint. Else, we're not going to do that. So let me just copy this thing right here and then paste it right here. We're not going to allow them access. Then we raise this error right here, and that's how we handle this. What I want to talk about now is, let me go back here. Let's say they did not provide this authorization here. So for now, let me remove this right here. It's the way we are handling our error. Okay, so if I send this request, you can see there's a lot of gibberish right here. I want an error handler function to handle this. So the way we do that is we can create an error handler function, which is going to be after the authenticate right here. We can create an app.use. You could create a separate function and then pass it in like we did with authenticate, but here in this case we want to pass in the function definition into this app.use. So this takes in the error, the request, then the response, and it also takes in the next. There are two things that we want to handle here. The response.status is going to be error.status, or is going to be just a 500. We're also going to handle the way we're going to handle this error. So it's going to be a response.json. We're going to respond with a JSON method. Okay, this is going to be an object with an error and also an error object, which is going to have a message error.message, which is this error right here. So we are passing in the error which we are getting here, this error right here. So this error message right here is coming from this error, which in turn comes from the error that we are creating here. So error.status, which is what we set up here. Otherwise, if we don't set any, it's going to be 500. Let me just put it as 401, right? In case we don't define any, it's going to be 401. So let me save this and try and run this. Send this. You can see now we're getting a better message right here. It says error, message unauthorized. Let me say you are unauthorized. So I changed down here. Let me copy this. I should also change it up here. So let me Control V, save that, and let's go back and try and test. You can see now the message says you are unauthorized. But if there is an auth header, let me save that. If we try and visit this endpoint, let's see what happens. Send request. You can see welcome to our website, because this is a valid username and password. Okay, let's tamper with this base64 encoding right here. Let's remove some characters and see whether it's going to work or not. So let me save that and send a request. You can see now again it says unauthorized. Okay, let's try this in our browser. Refresh. You can see this is what you get in your browser. Now you can say, let's say set password is test 1, 2, 3, 4. I remember that. Sign in. You can see we're getting access to our website. I hope this was helpful. If you find the video helpful, you can leave a like, leave a comment. You can also consider subscribing for more content like this. I hope to see you in my next tutorial. For now, I'm out. Peace.